Chapter 21. Damien was trapped, and he was slowly coming to grips with this fact. He had nearly delivered himself right into their hands before they even saw him, foolishly blundering right past them on his way down the slope. His guard had been down, his mind wandering somewhere while his body moved on autopilot. He was fast and agile, and he had quickly fled, but it looked like they had deployed a drone to follow him. The blinking colored lights in the corner of his vision told him that he was tagged by a flying machine that would follow him no matter where he went. The female officer wasn't very tall, but she looked angry, and she had caught up to him, which meant she was obviously fairly capable. He could try and attack her, maybe throw the spear or something. She was keeping a safe distance, and moving slowly to cut him off from the forest, pinning him against the edge of the river. Weeks of being on the run had finally caught up with him. A sense of weariness settled over him, not physical, but mental. The mission didn't seem to matter any longer, and the tiny transmitter, the small device that two men had died to retrieve from a country thousands of miles away, felt like the One Ring, a burden that he had carried long enough. He was supposed to hand this to some person that he didn't know in a faraway place he had never been to. A part of his mind demanded that he keep fighting, to do something, but there wasn't anything to do. The cop was right. He did seem to be out of options, but there was no way he could just give up. It was time to switch tactics. "What's your name?" he asked, hearing his voice out loud for just the second time in over a week. It was difficult to form the words, as though his sun-cracked lips had forgotten how to speak. The female cop looked a bit wary, scanning around the rocks, trees, and forest plants, as though she expected a second person to jump out. "I'm Damien," he stated, slowly lowering the makeshift spear to the ground and opening his hands to appear less threatening. "I'm a soldier, a U.S. Ranger." He pointed to the death's head tattoo on his right upper arm, barely visible under the dirt. "We're on the same team." It was silly, and obviously not true, but it was worth a shot. Cops tended to view other government workers more favorably. The officer said nothing, but her blue-green eyes locked with his and did not waver. A tiny wisp of dark blonde hair peered out from one ear, but the rest was tightly bound in a neat bun. The radio mic on the officer's body armor crackled with the transmission, badly garbled from the distance. She glanced down at the mic for a second, as though just remembering that it was there. Then her hand came up, and she clicked a reply. "I've got him. We're by a river that cuts through a deep gorge. Do you have eyes on?" Damien glanced up and scanned the cloudy sky, looking for dark blots that would indicate a drone. He saw it, floating serenely and silently 100 yards up, almost directly overhead. It was flashing a Christmas tree's worth of colors in all directions, obviously a visual beacon for anyone pursuing on the ground. He had no doubt that the high-quality camera was feeding real-time images to all of the cops in the area, as well as the FBI. "Bloody drones," he raged in his mind. It had been a fleet of them that had likely tipped off the authorities to his location a few days back, after he had foolishly decided to walk right out in the open, but there was a good chance that even tree cover would not have been enough to dodge these things. Damien had no idea how they had even known he was in the U.S., but it was certainly better to be caught by the American feds than the Chinese ones. He just had to pray that they didn't simply send him straight back to China. Chapter 22. Harvinder dozed in the front passenger seat of the FBI van, numb to the road noise and motion, as Hawking drove them deeper into Olympia Forest. He had not managed any real sleep for 2 nights now, and it would not be acceptable to try and drive if he was too exhausted to think. What finally woke him was the lack of noise as they pulled into a rest area and stopped. "Where are we?" he asked, trying to stifle a yawn that seemed to crack through regardless. Hawking flipped the computer open and turned the AirTouch map screen with his fingers. They were surrounded by green, representing forest, blended with mottled gray that represented rocks, and one small river running down the side of the mountain. "We're as close as we can get before going seriously off-road," Hawking said. Harvinder tried to zoom into the map, but it was just more green. "We need to get right on site as fast as possible. I know you hate driving up here, so let's quickly switch then." Hawking was not a confident driver, and he rarely left the office. He preferred to manage his teams from a distance, which was common amongst middle management of the FBI. Harvinder wished he could have had Suncroft or Miller with him, but they had been pulled to Washington along with the other top agents. The van was gas-powered, but the tires were in poor condition, and it would not be wise to push their speed through the treacherous logging roads that spread through this area. It was equipped with a police band radio, and he used it now, hoping to contact the state police team that had apparently found and apprehended their fugitive a little less than an hour ago. The range of these ancient radios was quite limited, but a deep booming voice responded immediately. "This is State Trooper Wellington. Glad to hear you're close. My partner is still out there, but she has your man, and she's bringing him back." Harvinder punched the gas and pulled the van back on the roadway, driving with one hand and using the radio with the other. "Stay where you are if possible, in case we need to do a search for anything." The reply was unreadable, and he turned off the pavement on the first of several logging roads that they would need to take in order to reach the state police unit. Under the van, a tiny drone silently detached, flying through the exhaust vapors coming from the tailpipe and shooting up 100 feet in the air to reestablish its satellite connection. The nuclear battery had fully charged up, and it had 20 minutes of flight time. A very primitive AI running inside the drone had detected a change when the van had moved onto the logging road, and it had calculated that it was likely that the FBI had found something. It would upload its data to the larger and more sophisticated AI running on the Russian yacht Zavoyevatel, alerting them to the discovery. Kostya had gone to bed early the night before. Something in his gut had told him that the next day would be the one he was waiting for, when the fugitive would be found, and his prize recovered. He had patiently waited while his family kept up their surveillance of the FBI whenever possible, giving him reports of their movements and activities. Several BRCA agents were also reporting to him, circumspectly, of course. The FBI would be monitoring cell phones that were active in the area, if they knew they existed. The drones only turned themselves on briefly to transmit data, and then went silent, so it was much less risky. Some people were capable of waking up at a certain time in the morning without any external assistance, but Kostya was not one of these, and he didn't care enough to try and develop such a ridiculous skill. He had people around him whose job it was to alert him, so he would let them stay up late, and he would be well rested when they called for him. The pounding on the door came at 6:45 a.m., and Kostya rose from the bed immediately. Luca was excited, his glasses tracking several drones that were doing something only he could see. "They have found him! On the mountain!" "Yes, obviously. Where is Oleg? That man better be getting ready to leave now." Kostya pushed past Luca, walking down the corridor to his brother-in-law's small stateroom. "He is gone, Kostya, flying the machine. He left 10 minutes ago." Luca sounded almost apologetic, although this was obviously good news. "Let us go to your office and we will watch the fun." Kostya smiled for the first time in nearly a week. He loved videos of war, and he would watch them all day long. A live video of destruction was even better, and he would not miss a single moment. Chapter 23. Astrid was dreaming again, and as always, she knew that it was a dream the entire time. In this version of the dream, her grandmother was the president of the entire Earth and was riding a chubby little pony with a long blonde comb-over. Astrid cheered them on in a huge stadium filled with well-dressed white people, while everyone held a small candle. For some reason, this dream always filled her eyes with tears, and she would wake up with her face wet. In this dream, she was once again exultant, singing a song that had no words and holding her small candle cradled in her palm. The center of the stadium cracked down the middle, the dirt crumbling and shattering in a long, straight line. It moved apart, and the cheering turned into screaming as the stadium seats began to fall into the gaping chasm that was yawning from the center. A roar of flame and smoke filled the hole, rising like Satan from the pits of hell. Something was erupting from the ever-widening gap, pushing into the sky, riding into the stars with a massive column of fire that stretched deep into the earth and rose into the sky as far as you could see. The scream that she voiced was silent, and it was still bound up in her lungs as she woke, pitching forward into the seat restraints of the Mini Falcon. She glimpsed her reflection on the glass canopy, her mouth open in a silent scream of terror, and her eyes bulging from their sockets. She released the air locked inside her, exhaling to try and release the tension. The memory of the nightmare receded. To distract herself, she switched on the AirTouch display and found her location. She was in something called Class B airspace, 30 miles east of Seattle, Washington. The batteries were at 37%, which was good for about an hour of flight time. The sunrise was visible just over the far distant expanse of gray ocean, and she saw that it was just about 6 a.m. The journey had been much more difficult than she had expected, and it had taken several days instead of just one. It was challenging to find a charging port that was operational in the West Coast area, and there had been none in Idaho, prompting a long detour south through Utah and Nevada. Spring rainstorms had made flying impossible for 12 hours, and she had spent the entire time searching a small, nameless town for a restaurant so she could eat some real food. At least the Falcon's seat would recline, making it possible to get a decent amount of sleep, even while flying. She had tried her best to unlock the Falcon's administrator functions, which would give her full control of the craft, rather than just picking a destination and letting autopilot navigate. The software was locked down with a password, which was absurd, since she was already required to authenticate herself just to use the stupid thing. Her next destination was McCord Air Force Base, which had a fast charger system for this type of craft. The Falcon landed smoothly beside its charger on the wet concrete, joining 3 other similar machines. Several Air Force lackeys tried to approach the vehicle and talk to her, but she waved them off impatiently. Now that she was in Washington State, the importance of unlocking the administrator controls became critical. Astrid used the onboard computer to start searching through agency contacts, looking for someone whom she might be able to convince to hand over the password. As the list scrolled, she recognized the name Austin Massey. Her office had hired a team of coders with security clearances to work on a very sensitive database, and he had been on the team. As a junior CIA member, she had been given the unenviable task of overseeing the entire project, and had been forced to suffer a number of excruciatingly boring meetings with the dorky coding team. The pudgy blonde kid had been particularly irritating, and it had taken all of her willpower not to cuss him out daily. Austin lived in Washington, and his contract was still active with the agency. His billing history showed that he was frequently called upon to fix the database that he had helped to build, and was earning a decent amount of money doing so. This was excellent news, because he would also have access to high-level agency information. As the phone rang to the programmer, Astrid took a second to plaster the most innocent smile on her normally sullen face. "Hi, Austin. This is Special Agent Astrid Clinton with the agency. I've got a special request for you." Austin had declined to turn his camera on, and his voice sounded thick with sleep. "All right, but it's double the hourly rate before 8 a.m., minimum 3 hours. The stupid moron was only concerned with getting paid. Well, that was fine. It wasn't her money being spent. "That's okay. Just bill whatever the cost is. I'm in a little bit of a hurry here, and I promise this won't take long." The effort required to not snap and lash out was starting to make her left eye twitch. Another long pause. "Okay, go ahead." "I need the user manual for the Mini Falcon II. It's a small aircraft we use for important work." She heard keyboard noises from the tiny speaker. "Yep, I've got that here. I'll send it to your agency email." "Wait, no. Send it to my encrypted message center. I can't access that email right now." Astrid had a private, anonymous, and heavily encrypted message system set up for exactly this purpose. Agency emails were subject to being read by higher-ups, and she didn't need anyone to know what she was planning. She read out the address of the encrypted message platform, and mentally dared him to challenge her about breaking policy. Austin didn't seem to care, and he sent the manual to the private server without comment. "One more thing, Austin, and this is important. I'm on a very time-sensitive and dangerous mission, and my Falcon has locked me out. I need the password for administrator access." There was no reply for at least a minute. "I don't think I have that. Not in this database." "Can you look it up somewhere else?" Hang on. Let me check something." "Okay, the manual has a default password for admin. Try this out. It's 123123. Astrid typed that into the screen, expecting to see the red X that marked an incorrect entry, but instead, the administrator menu appeared. She was stunned. The CIA had not reset the factory password for a highly advanced billion-dollar aircraft. "Did that work?" "Yeah, it worked." "Unbelievable. Thanks, Austin. You definitely earned your 3 hours." She was genuinely cheerful as she disconnected and started scrolling through the vast menu. There was a very sophisticated sensor package and a stealth mode that she hadn't known about. The sensor package included several deployable mini-drones with about an hour flight time and HUD access that pulled in camera views from those drones. The fast charger had topped her off to 90% in just 15 minutes, so she quickly disconnected and warmed up the Falcon's turbines. Because she wasn't a certified pilot, Astrid allowed the Falcon to depart using its autopilot. But now she could simply pick the direction of travel without having a specific destination. After leaving military airspace, she decided to move closer to the coastline and send yet another message to that idiot Patel, who was supposed to be updating her as things unfolded. The Falcon was blasting over the rugged terrain of the Olympic National Forest when a strange alert sounded inside the cockpit. A flashing red warning appeared with the words, "Warning, interception." She had turned on the Falcon's sensor package to its fullest extent, which meant that it was scanning the surrounding area. The machine had never been intended to operate this way over U.S. soil. It was actually meant for operation in hostile environments. It certainly had sensors that could detect and identify hostile aircraft, but how was that possible here? As if in response, an image popped up of an aircraft that was quite similar to her own, but clearly not made by the U.S. It was larger and longer, but not much bigger than a small private plane. The image had a label underneath, Sokol, Russian, and a small picture of the Russian tricolor flag. Her heartbeat surged, and she felt a cold sweat on her neck. There was a flashing red dot on the overhead map, moving across perpendicular to her own path of travel. Astrid slammed the Falcon to a complete standstill and dropped her altitude to just above treetop level. The image of the Sokol showed that this particular model of aircraft was armed with 4 guns, while she was completely unarmed in the Falcon. For a brief second, she weighed the option of reporting this situation to the agency, alerting them to the presence of a foreign gunship flying over American airspace. They could send in military jets or drones to intercept, and they would demand that she pull back. The thought that she might be told to stand down, losing her chance to recover the valuable technology, was the deciding factor. She would report this to someone. It would be insane to not do so. But she would continue to pursue this bogey at a distance. If the Russians knew where the fugitive was, then she wanted to be there as well. Send a text message to FBI agent Harvinder Patel. Found contact Harvinder Patel. What would you like to say? The computer's voice came back. The CIA is tracking a Sokol-type Russian gunship moving over the Olympic Forest to the east. Watch yourself out there. She still needed to avoid implicating herself in this growing mess. The Falcon began to move again, but this time she turned on stealth mode. The aircraft began to move forward at a slower pace, keeping just above the terrain to avoid being seen on radar. Oleg Belov had not flown at all in the last 5 years, and it had been nearly 2 decades since his last sortie for the Russian Air Force. The Sokol was much more advanced than any helicopter he had ever been in, and it practically flew itself. The canopy showed nothing but trees, barely silhouetted in the morning sunrise, as he tightly gripped the twin joysticks attached to the seat. Another empty seat was situated behind him, which was where the navigator and weapons operator would traditionally be positioned. He could still fire the main armaments from his seat with the trigger button on the right joystick control. It had been 6 days since he had last had a drink. 6 excruciating days filled with headaches, chills, and shakes. Oleg reached into his flight jacket and pulled out the water bottle, spinning off the cap with one finger. The pungent scent of vodka greeted his nostrils, and he guzzled from the plastic bottle, feeling the delicious burn of the vodka cascading down his gullet. Kostya expected him to fly into hostile territory with no wingman, and very few directions, except a square on a map. Flying sober was distasteful under the best of circumstances, but in this case, it was utterly intolerable. The alcohol would calm his nerves and bring his old skills back into focus. He already felt better as the intoxicating beverage soaked into his body and bones. The shaking and nerves subsided, and Oleg became the old fighter pilot once again, flying a mission against his enemies just as in the old days. Chapter 24. Damien Weber stood next to the Washington State Police SUV, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists. The female trooper had her hand around his arm, holding him in place as though he would suddenly start running again. A profound sense of disappointment had come over him as they walked through the forest. The feeling that there was more that could have been done. He had made it so far, sailing across the vast Pacific Ocean in a rusty tub that should have sunk to the bottom or run out of fuel. Then he swam 70 miles to shore and survived for more than a week in the woods with no supplies at all. It had all been for nothing. In the end, the weakened U.S. government still had the resources to find somebody, if they really wanted to, no matter how well they were hidden. He idly wondered what the billionaire Ike Zipoor was doing now, if he suspected that they had failed in their mission. Even wealthy people were not immune to the government if they decided you were an enemy, as Donald Trump had found out. He felt the weight of the cross on his neck, and he wondered if the CIA or FBI would interrogate him. The roadway was well lit now, the sun finally peeking over the saddle between 2 mountains, and casting its warmth across the rocky landscape, driving wisps of steam to rise from the cold, wet gravel. A huge black officer was standing by the police vehicle, stowing the small drone into its case. The roadway sloped down and curved out of sight, and from that direction came a windowless panel van, grinding up the gravel towards them. There were no markings on the van, but it was a light gray rather than black, and was also gas-powered like the cop's cruiser. It rolled to a stop behind the officers, and both doors open. The two men were dressed in civilian clothes, wearing black soft body armor emblazoned with the letters FBI. Right on schedule, he thought. He turned to look at the female trooper, and to his surprise, she gave him a sympathetic smile for just a second before resuming the tough chick facade. One of the FBI agents approached, sticking out his hand to the big cop. They seemed to know one another from somewhere else, and chatted for a second as the other FBI agent stood by, looking somewhat bored. "Harvey, you should have seen this one. She ran this guy down like it was nothing." The huge black cop ambled over to his partner, the female who had indeed run him down. Of course, they had the help of a drone and a massive river gorge, but the girl had been pretty fast on her feet. "Hello, officer. I'm Harvinder Patel, special agent in charge of the Washington branch." They shook hands like Damien wasn't even there. "I'm Officer Thiessen," she smiled warmly as she returned the handshake, her left hand never leaving Damien's arm even for a second. "Let's get him tucked away and we can debrief." Officer Thiessen held up her hand. "Just hold on to that. We need to search him first." Damien felt his heartbeat surge. They would find his cross necklace and take it from him. Someone would see the transmitter twisted onto it and ask him what it was. It was nearly over, and he didn't know whether he was happy or terrified. It was the big cop who searched him, probably wanting to feel like he could take some credit for the catch, even though his partner did the hard work. Everything in his pockets was removed and placed on the hood of the police car. At last, the necklace was slipped over his head, and all of the contents were unceremoniously dumped into a clear plastic bag. No one said anything about the necklace or the transmitter until Agent Patel came up and asked if he could conduct another search. The cops looked surprised at this, but they waved him to go ahead. Agent Patel took his time searching Damien, feeling into every nook and cranny. Every pocket was thoroughly gone through, and even the seams of his clothing were inspected closely. Finally, Patel grabbed the bag and examined the items inside. He seemed to give no special attention to the cross, and finally handed the bag back to the officers. "Put him in your squad. We need to talk." Chapter 25. Harvinder felt angry, but he was not surprised that they hadn't found anything on the fugitive. He had more than likely stashed the stolen technology somewhere along his journey, intending to come back to it later, or more likely, have someone else come and retrieve it. They would need to bring several search teams up to this area and conduct a thorough grid search. The drones would be of great value in this process, but it was still very slow and tedious, especially in such unfriendly terrain. He grabbed his phone and sent an update on the encrypted channel to the 7 agents who were already en route. They could start prepping the drones that had been used to conduct high-level surveillance, switching the optics to enable them to search at ground level. It was a clunky system, and there were better drones for the task, but when you worked for the FBI, you made do with what you had. Hawking was talking on a cell phone, which irritated Harvinder, as phone calls were very easy to grab with surveillance equipment. They really needed to keep this investigation a secret while they searched the forest to see what might have been hidden or discarded. In the meantime, he would need to send the fugitive back to the cube to conduct some interrogation. There was no way for him to do both, so the state troopers would need to drive him all the way there. Harvinder beckoned to the female trooper and spoke quietly with her out of earshot of anyone else. "We need this guy secured at our office in Seattle, ASAP. Do you think you can make this happen?" Officer Thiessen nodded. "Are we sure this is the right guy?" "Yes, he matched the description perfectly, and he tried to run when you pulled up. It seems like he's given up, no protesting or anything. The man knows he's caught, Maybe he's just planning to talk once we get him into a room. Okay. How far away is your office? It's 2 hours, maybe a little longer if you count the time to get back down to the highway. My guys are on their way up here now, so we need to secure this area and start searching for any dropped items. Are you absolutely sure he didn't have anything else on him? Soraya shook her head. No, just some junk in his pocket, clothes, and homemade rope, and whatever else is in that plastic bag. Do you want to take his stuff so you can have a closer look? Harvinder looked at the dirty clothing in the bag. No, take it back to our office. We'll get our forensic teams on everything. He slapped the roof of the cruiser and pointed to Luther. You're a good man, Luth. Say hi to your wife for me, will you? Luther was checking the handcuffs on the thin, scraggly fugitive and putting him in the back cage of their vehicle. Thanks, Patel. She'll be glad to know you're climbing the ladder up there. The FBI could use more guys like you, and less like... He trailed off and looked at Hawking, who was still pacing the gravel and jabbering into his phone. Harvinder nodded and said nothing, but gave his old friend one last handshake before they started the long trip to the FBI office in Seattle. Damien slumped in the back seat, resting his legs against the hard metal wall of the partition that divided the front from the back. There was very little legroom, and he wondered how anyone larger than he was could possibly fit in there. He shifted to the middle, hoping to see something on the computer that might give him some intel. The AirTouch monitor was blocked from view by the barrels of a carbine rifle and a shotgun that sat in a locked cradle between the seats. A small plastic window could be opened from the front, but not the back. Hey, officer! The sound of his voice echoed in the cage. Neither of the officers responded, so maybe they couldn't hear him. The plastic probably muffled his voice considerably, and he was still having a hard time vocalizing after not speaking for so long. He decided to try again, louder. Hey, officer! Officer Thiessen. The female was sitting in the passenger seat, and she glanced over her shoulder at him. She looked to be on edge, but something her partner said seemed to make her relax. She reached back and fumbled with the small sliding portal, trying to retract it. She managed to get it open, and now Damien could hear small sounds from the front compartment through the metal grate of the opening. What do you want? She sounded a little bit impatient. Do you have any water? I haven't had much to drink in the last couple of days. Thiessen looked around, then threw up her hands. We can get you water in a bit. There's nowhere to stop right now. It had been worth a shot. He figured he had one more question before they got tired of hearing from him. Just one more thing. I was wondering what they told you about me. The FBI, I mean. The two cops shared a glance, and they must have come to some unspoken agreement. We don't know anything about you. This is just a taxi ride. Once we get you there, it's not our problem anymore. The FBI is probably going to have a lot of questions, I'm sure. Sounds like fun. She gave a humorless smile. Damien rested his head against the hard plastic partition, letting the road vibration numb his mind as they drove. Time passed, and he began to doze. The pressure increased on his forehead painfully as the vehicle suddenly ground to a halt, the tires sliding on the loose gravel. He looked up and saw that they were still surrounded by trees on both sides, but there was something in front of them, just around a corner. His view was obscured and he couldn't tell what it was. Maybe a tree had fallen across the road. He squinted through the multiple layers of glass and plastic, trying to make out what was across the road. It appeared to be another van, parked completely sideways. The cops were animated, talking to each other too quietly for him to hear. The female cop rolled her window down a bit and unbuckled her seatbelt. Time seemed to freeze, and Damien felt the hair on his neck stand up. He knew exactly what this was, his years of training as an Army Ranger suddenly forcing his body into combat mode. Get down! It's an ambush! His voice echoed into the back of the cruiser, much louder than he had expected. He caught a fleeting glimpse of the big black cop's eyes turning to his, the panic beginning to register. No matter how long he lived, he would never forget seeing the last moments of this man's life before the shooting started. Windows shattered, and the windshield turned into a craze of spiderwebs as bullets punched through the unarmored glass. The big trooper gave a short cry, and the last thing that Damien saw before he flung himself below the window line was a spray of red striking the clear plastic divider. He pulled his legs up to his chest and desperately shoved his body into the small foot space, trying to get out of the line of fire. The shooting seemed to last forever, but it was probably just a few seconds. His eyes were instinctively shut tight, and he opened them slowly, expecting the hail of bullets to resume. The back seat was covered in glass, and he was stuck in the footwell, his hands still cuffed behind his back and useless for leverage. He started kicking his legs in panic, and to his great relief, he was able to wriggle back onto the seat. Having your hands behind your back is a major disadvantage, but Damien was pretty flexible. In a few painful seconds, he was able to stretch his cuffed hands under his legs, pulling them to the front. They were still cuffed together, but at least now he could use them. He quickly peeked up above the window line to try and get an idea of what was happening outside. The windows were completely shot out, and he could hear shouting outside that seemed to be far away. He needed to get out of this vehicle. It was inside the kill box with no real protection. A scuffling noise from the front of the vehicle caught his attention, and he risked a quick peek over the front seat. The plastic divider was in shambles, most of the mesh was missing, and the plexiglass panel had fallen somewhere. The big cop was completely still, his head tilted back and covered in blood. Dead for sure. The female officer was crouched down in the footspace, holding her pistol and looking at him with a terrified, angry look. "We need to get out of here. They're going to start shooting again any minute," Damien shouted to her. She nodded, but didn't move. There was some blood on her arm, and a little bit in her hair. "Are you hit? Hey, look at me." She looked at him, frowning, and then seemed to notice that she had blood on her body. "I don't think so. Glass, I think." "Okay, we gotta get out of this vehicle, like right now. Can you unlock this gun right here?" He grabbed the barrel of the carbine, trying to keep his head below the windshield line of sight. There was no movement outside, and he could no longer hear any noise. The female police officer pulled her body up onto the glass-covered seat and actually pointed her pistol at him. "Don't touch that! I will shoot you if you try to grab a weapon." Another barrage of shooting sent shards of windshield glass, plastic, and stuffing from the seats swirling into the air. Damien flung himself back down as far as he could get, reflexively covering his face with his arms. He tried to listen to the number and location of the shots, but the noise of bullets tearing through the vehicle was all he could hear. The shooting paused again, and he realized that these shooters were simply emptying the magazine as fast as they could. Amateurs, he realized. That was good, and it was probably the only reason that they were still alive. Even amateurs would eventually get lucky and start flanking the vehicle. Once the bullets started coming from the sides, the huge engine block would not be there to absorb them, and they would both be cut to pieces in seconds. If this had been an electric vehicle, they both would have been dead long ago. Thank God for gasoline engines. Damien didn't wait. Once the shooting stopped, he lunged back through the opening, pushing his cuffed hands down to the duty belt of the female's dead partner. Luckily, the cop had been right-handed, and his gun was just within reach. Officer Thiessen saw this and shouted at him again. "Stop it! Stop grabbing his gun!" She sounded terrified. "If we don't start shooting back, we're both gonna die," he bellowed at her, suddenly furious. Her refusal to see the situation for what it was would be the death of them both. The Glock was already unstrapped, and Damien realized that the big guy had been in the middle of drawing his weapon when they were ambushed. The weapon slid out, and he tried to reach around to grab a spare magazine, but the ammo pouches were too far. He knew that Glocks could have high-capacity magazines, and he guessed that he had 15 rounds in the mag. Against multiple shooters, who obviously had rifles, it was pitiful. But the shooters were also wild amateurs, so perhaps he could outshoot them. "I'm going to dive out my window and start shooting, and when I do, you need to get yourself out. Find some cover and start shooting back." He didn't wait to hear a reply, but slithered his body out the side window, rolling to the ground and then under the vehicle in a smooth motion. That wouldn't have been possible just a few weeks ago, but he had lost a lot of dead weight trekking through the forest. Another barrage of shooting, the noise echoing through the trees and making it impossible to pinpoint direction by sound. They had to be in the front, probably near their ambush vehicle. Vehicles were magnets for people looking for cover, even though they were made of little more than the thinnest layers of metal and plastic. Damien lay prone beneath the police vehicle and scanned what he could see. A foot moved out, right beside the wheel of the van that was blocking the road, and he fired 2 slow shots. A high-pitched scream came from somewhere, and he knew that he had scored a hit. Now he heard more shouting. There were at least 2 males here as well. The scream had sounded pretty high-pitched, and he thought maybe it was a woman. He scooted forward and immediately started a series of slow, aimed shots at the van. This would hopefully keep the bastards from peeking out, and allow the female cop to get her butt out of the kill box. Sure enough, after 3 shots, he heard the door open and the sound of a foot crunching on gravel. Officer Thiessen jumped out and ran to the back of the police vehicle, and he saw her take a kneeling stance. "I'm coming," he called, scooting himself backwards. Another round of rapid shots sounded, and this time he could see small puffs of smoke from the shooter's position as they moved sideways from the ambush van. The bullets seemed to hit the top of their vehicle, not coming anywhere near them. The recoil was pushing the barrel of the ambusher's weapon higher with each shot, another sign that these were rank amateurs. Damien fired 2 more rounds, one into the rusty side of the van and another into the trees where he thought the shooter might be. He scooted all the way back and rose to his knees behind the vehicle. The female cop was covering the woods on their right, so he took the left. "Cover and move. Fighting retreat. That means shoot and move." "I know what it means," she interrupted him. She fired 3 slow shots and then started moving backward quickly. Damien fired a single round on each side of the vehicle, moving as he fired. "Moving," he shouted, which was the verbal signal to your teammates that they needed to start shooting to cover your movement. He heard the pistol bark, and he quickly jumped down the steep slope. The police cruiser was now about 10 yards away, and the edge of the road was available for cover. They could slip away from the scene and regroup, but something tugged at his mind, a terrible feeling of dread. The necklace. I've got to grab the necklace. Chapter 26. There was only one reason that they were being ambushed in the first place. Somebody knew that he was there, and they were trying to steal the AI technology. He could save his own hide by slipping away, but he would fail his primary mission, and there could be some serious unknown consequences for allowing this technology to be stolen by people who are willing to murder cops. It was bad enough that the FBI wanted the tech, but foreign governments or terrorists might also be trying to recover it as well. A roaring noise filled the air, overpowering the sound of shooting. A black silhouette appeared, hovering over the trees to the right of the van. The aircraft was sleek, about the size of a small helicopter, but without the rotors. Instead, it had 6 cones at the bottom of the flat body that appeared to be blasting air downward at high speed. Damien had seen similar vehicles before, in pictures. The U.S. military operated a bunch of these, but this design was unfamiliar to him. It had no markings, and it was painted a mottled, camo style, sporting a large glass canopy that seemed to be tinted so heavily you could barely see inside. The craft moved slowly, making a lazy circle around the 2 vehicles. The shooting had stopped, and Damien did his best to hide out of sight of the large aircraft, ducking behind the road and pulling Officer Thiessen down as well. "Don't let it see you," he hissed at her. "It's the military. Look, you see the guns?" The vehicle had small wing-like structures protruding from the sides, like an attack helicopter. Mounted under these baby wings were several machine guns, which gave him a chill. There was no way that this was American. It had no markings, and it didn't look anything like the jet drones he had seen American forces operate. American jets had a very distinct look, with the armaments mounted on the nose. This jet had a Chinese look to it, but he thought it could also be Russian. "That's not the military. Trust me," he begged, grabbing her sleeve and tugging her down. She yanked her arm away and stood, waving her hands in the air as a signal. The jet responded, turning to face their position. It wobbled a bit, as though the pilot was having trouble with the controls, and then puffs of smoke appeared from the wings as the machine guns opened up. Damien tackled the female cop, sending them both tumbling down the slope into the cover of heavy trees and shrubs. He felt branches and pine needles stabbing him as they fell, both of them slamming against the moss-covered trunk of a spruce tree. A thick canopy spread overhead, blocking any view of the sky. Rounds whistled above, smashing into tree trunks and sending splinters of wood raining down. None of the bullets came close, and the shooting stopped quickly. The noise of the jet changed, and a vague alteration of the light was the only visual indicator that the craft had moved, resuming its circling of the area. Damien realized that he was basically lying on top of Officer Thiessen, and he looked at her. She had blood streaked across her face and hair, and a nice bruise growing on her cheek, but she was still quite pretty. It seemed weird to keep staring at her, so he quickly moved his eyes away and scrambled back. "You hurt? Anything broken?" She patted herself for a second and then shook her head. "I'm supposed to be asking you that question," she said, as she retrieved her Glock from where it had fallen a few feet away. "Do you mind? It's a lot harder to shoot with my hands cuffed together." He held his hands up and tried to look non-threatening. Officer Thiessen reached into her vest to retrieve her key, and Damien shivered in relief as she unlocked his wrists from the restraints. "We need to go back up. I want to get something from your vehicle." She stared at him in disbelief, and her eyes narrowed. "What are you going to get?" She knows. Can't lie to this one, he thought. "My property, and the rifle you have in the front." She didn't move, looking up at the thick layer of trees concealing them from view. "That's insane. They'll kill you before you even get up to the road." Another burst of gunfire could be heard, but it sounded distant. "They're shooting at each other. Come on, Officer Thiessen. This might be our chance." She holstered her Glock and followed him up the incline, keeping her hand on the gun and eyes to the sky in case the aircraft reappeared. Damien sliced the pie over the roadway, moving slowly to avoid attracting attention. His military training was in full swing. He was thinking and moving like a ranger once again after being out for 4 years. The jet drone was hovering further up the road and was facing away from them, so he didn't waste a second, scrambling up to the road and sprinting for the bullet-ridden police cruiser. He quickly flipped up the back gate, where the plastic bag containing his meager property was sitting on top of a pile of gear partially destroyed by bullets from the jet and from the ambush. He seized the bag and tucked it into his shirt. Nothing else in the back looked to be of any use, so he rushed up to the front passenger door and flung it open. He wanted that carbine, but as he yanked on it, it refused to move. Of course, it's locked up. He pulled on a metal flap that seemed to be the locking mechanism, and to his surprise, it came loose in his hand. It must have been struck by gunfire at some point, destroying it. As he pulled the carbine out from the cradle, he glanced at the big cop, still sitting dead in his seat. The man's head was leaning forward as though in prayer, his body sparkling with broken glass that had spalled from the windows. A buzz of gunfire ripped up the roadway, and Damien was once again forced to fling himself underneath the ruined cop car. The underside of the engine was soaked in foul-smelling fluids, and it was quite a struggle to keep himself from lying directly in whatever was pooling underneath. There was now constant shooting from multiple directions, and as before, it was nearly impossible to see anything from under the vehicle. The familiar sound of the Glock pistol came from the side of the road, which meant that Officer Thiessen was exposing herself to give him cover. Damien dragged himself and the carbine out from the car, checking to make sure that he still had the Glock tucked in his pants pocket. Thankfully, the carbine had a magazine loaded, and he pulled the cocking handle to load a round. The jet drone was still moving in that now familiar circle, which kept its forward-facing machine guns on target, but also exposed the canopy. Rifle bullets on the fuselage would be nothing more than spitballs, but the canopy might be a weak point if he hit it in the right spot. With his back to the police vehicle, he took 3 aimed shots at the canopy, scoring at least 1 hit on the glass. Immediately, the jet drone seemed to go crazy, flying erratically around the scene. Damien wondered if he had actually managed a lucky hit on the pilot, but it seemed unlikely. The jet was moving up the roadway and turning to fly back down. More bullets hit the gravel as the pilot blasted everything in sight with machine gun fire. Damien was already moving, running to the edge of the road where Thiessen was hopefully taking cover. He dived over the edge and tumbled several yards down the slope. This time, he dodged the tree trunk, finding himself under the same layer of thick vegetation that had provided concealment just a few moments before. Officer Thiessen was leaning up against the tree, gripping her left arm and looking pale. A rivulet of fresh, dark red blood was streaming from beneath the sleeve of her gray police shirt, blooming through the fabric across her shoulder. "Oh, crap, did you get hit?" He grabbed her sleeve and tried to pull it up, but she weakly pushed him back. "I'm holding it. Went right through." She was having trouble speaking, and her knees started to buckle. "Do you have a cat?" he asked, using the army slang for tourniquet without thinking. She shook her head, apparently understanding the term. National Guard. Gotta be. That might explain the skillful shooting and moving, a skill that most cops weren't even taught. Without hesitation, he tore a long strip from the bottom of his shirt, going around the bottom to get a nice, long, thin piece of cloth. He wrapped it around her upper arm several times and tied a small knot. Then, he tucked a small stick into the knot, giving it a few twists to keep the pressure and cut the blood flow. A pass-through gunshot wound to the arm wasn't as dangerous as a leg or chest wound, but blood loss would quickly lead to shock and then death. They still had enemies out here, and they both needed to get the heck out of the area. "Hold that." He moved her hand up to the stick, closing her fingers around it. "Keep it tight. It'll slow down blood loss and keep you from going into shock." He suspected that she was going into shock already, so they would need to move quickly. The officer would need her good arm to hold the tourniquet, so Damien would need to use her injured arm as leverage to move her. She was about 3 inches shorter than his 5'11", so he wrapped her arm around his shoulders, reached around her back, and grabbed her gun belt. The two of them descended the slope for a long time that way, moving slowly but steadily. Somehow, the woman kept herself from falling or passing out, although he did hear her grunting in pain from time to time. Looking back, he could never decide if the trip down the mountain had taken a long time or no time at all. It was a blur of staggering from tree to tree, the only thought in his mind being the need to get distance from the gunfight going on behind them and get somewhere that he could assess the situation and look after the cop's gunshot wound.